May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. For the Allies, it was a moment of celebration. For Germany, it was the collapse of a nation. The Third Reich, which had once boasted it would last 1,000 years, had lasted barely 12. Its cities lay in ruins, its economy shattered, and millions of its people faced an uncertain future. But while the guns had fallen silent, the suffering for ordinary Germans was far from over. In fact, for many, it was only beginning. The Allied victory brought with it not only military occupation but also a wave of mass displacement unprecedented in European history. Between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans were uprooted from territories in Eastern Europe, from East Prussia, Silesia, Pomerania, and the Sudetenland, as borders were redrawn and Soviet forces advanced westward. Families fled on foot, dragging what little they could carry. Many perished along the way from starvation, exposure, or attacks. The war's end also unleashed a deep hunger for retribution. The atrocities committed by the Nazi regime had left scars across Europe. In countries occupied by the Germans, resentment ran high, and in some cases, it turned violent. German civilians found themselves targeted for revenge, sometimes regardless of whether they had supported the regime or not. In the Soviet-occupied areas, conditions were especially harsh. Red Army troops, fresh from years of brutal warfare, exacted their own form of justice. Reports of mass sexual violence, looting, and execution spread fear among the population. In the western zones, life was less violent but still grim. The infrastructure was destroyed, food supplies were limited, and Allied bombing had left millions homeless. By the summer of 1945, Allied authorities faced the monumental task of governing a defeated nation. The Potsdam Conference in July formalized Germany's division into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Berlin itself, though deep in Soviet territory, was split the same way. This division would shape Germany's fate for decades. But before reconstruction could even begin, there was the immediate question of survival. Food shortages became critical. In some urban areas, rations fell to just 1,000 calories per day, barely enough to sustain life. The black market flourished as desperate people traded valuables for bread or potatoes. Malnutrition, disease, and despair stalked the streets. For many Germans, the end of the war was not liberation, it was the beginning of exile, hunger, and humiliation. The victors wrote the peace, but for the vanquished, peace was simply a different kind of hardship. And as we explore this untold chapter of history, don't forget, subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it so more people can learn about the forgotten human cost of war. By June 1945, the Allied powers had assumed full control over occupied Germany. Their initial focus was not reconstruction but demilitarization, denazification, and dismantling the foundations of Hitler's war machine. Allied military governments issued orders to dissolve the German armed forces, outlaw the Nazi Party, and arrest its leading figures. In the cities, posters appeared calling for citizens to surrender weapons, Nazi insignia, and propaganda material. The Allies viewed Germany not just as a defeated enemy, but as a dangerous ideology that had to be eradicated root and branch. In the American and British zones, denazification questionnaires, known as Fragebogen, were distributed to millions of Germans. Citizens were required to disclose their wartime activities, party membership, and personal affiliations. These documents would decide whether a person could keep their job, work in public service, or even live in certain areas. Meanwhile, in the Soviet zone, the approach was more sweeping. Entire classes of people, industrialists, landowners, and former officials, were stripped of property and often deported to labor camps in the USSR. Large estates were broken up, factories dismantled, and railways loaded with machinery headed east as war reparations. The Soviet administration saw these removals as both punishment and a means to rebuild their own war-torn country. Everyday life for civilians was marked by scarcity and disruption. The German currency was in collapse, and Allied-issued military scrip or barter became the de facto means of exchange. Basic services like electricity and public transport were unreliable. In many cities, rubble still blocked main streets months after the fighting had ended, a visible reminder that the war's devastation could not be cleared overnight. Adding to the hardship, millions of refugees and expellees continued to pour into what remained of Germany. Trains arrived from the east overloaded with families carrying nothing but small bundles. Temporary camps sprang up in abandoned military barracks, schools, and warehouses. Local administrations, overwhelmed and under-resourced, struggled to house and feed them. Tensions sometimes flared between longtime residents and the newcomers, as competition for jobs, shelter, and food grew fierce. Culturally and psychologically, Germans were entering unfamiliar territory. For 12 years, Nazi ideology had dominated public life, controlling the press, the schools, and the arts. Now, with the propaganda machine dismantled, Germans were confronted with Allied-controlled media. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and films presented not only the facts of the Nazi defeat but also the full extent of the regime's crimes, concentration camp footage, testimonies from survivors, and evidence from the Nuremberg trials soon to come. The aim was clear: to make Germans face their past, accept their nation's guilt, and begin anew under Allied supervision. Yet for many ordinary people, these revelations came at a time when survival consumed all their energy. It was a Germany stripped of illusions, humbled by defeat, and entering a new, uncertain chapter under foreign rule. By September 1945, Germany had become the epicenter of one of the largest population movements in European history. In the months following the war, millions of ethnic Germans were expelled from territories in Eastern Europe, from Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. These expulsions were not spontaneous. They were sanctioned by the Allied leaders at the Potsdam Conference in July-August 1945, who agreed that German populations outside the new borders should be transferred to occupied Germany in an orderly and humane manner. In reality, the process was rarely humane. Entire communities were given only hours to gather their belongings before being forced onto trains or compelled to march on foot. Many endured long, brutal journeys with little food or shelter. Disease, exposure, and exhaustion claimed thousands of lives along the way. Those who survived often arrived in Germany with nothing but the clothes they wore, entering a country itself in ruins and unable to provide adequate housing or supplies. The refugee crisis transformed the demographic landscape. Towns that had once been relatively stable were now overcrowded. In Bavaria, Schleswig-Holstein, and the American zone in general, rural villages saw their populations double almost overnight. Disused barns, half-collapsed buildings, and even stables were converted into makeshift shelters. Local resentment simmered as residents were ordered to take in strangers, often former residents of territories they had never visited. Food shortages deepened the crisis. The 1945 harvest was meager, and much of the farmland lay neglected after years of war. Allied military authorities implemented rationing systems, but even these were inadequate. In the British zone, the daily ration for adults sometimes dropped to under 1,000 calories, far below subsistence level. Malnutrition became widespread, particularly among children and the elderly. Black markets flourished, with cigarettes, coffee, and chocolate becoming the most valuable commodities. Survival often depended on resourcefulness. Women, the majority of the remaining adult population, scavenged bricks from bombed-out buildings to trade for food. Others dismantled wrecked military equipment to sell as scrap metal. In some areas, barter replaced currency altogether. A pair of boots might be exchanged for a sack of potatoes, or a day's labor for a few liters of milk. Despite these hardships, Allied occupation authorities pressed ahead with the political reorientation of Germany. Local elections were introduced in some zones by late 1945, though candidates were carefully vetted to exclude former Nazis. Political parties began to re-emerge, the Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, and Communists, but their activities were closely monitored. Meanwhile, across all zones, the war crimes trials were making headlines. Germans were confronted with detailed accounts of atrocities committed in their name. For many, these revelations clashed painfully with personal memories of service, sacrifice, and loss. Some denied the evidence, others were forced to reconcile their suffering with the undeniable guilt of their nation's recent past. Germany in autumn 1945 was a nation not only defeated but displaced, trying to survive in a landscape reshaped by war, occupation, and the largest forced migration in its history. The first post-war winter, from November 1945 to March 1946, was one of the most punishing Germany had ever faced. The country was already physically shattered, cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure in tatters, rail lines broken, and power stations destroyed. Now, as temperatures fell well below freezing, the fragility of the post-war order became painfully clear. Coal shortages hit particularly hard. The Allied zones faced severe transportation bottlenecks, meaning even when coal was mined in the Ruhr or Silesia, it could not be delivered efficiently to cities. In many urban centers, heating simply ceased. Families crowded into a single room to conserve warmth, sealing windows with cardboard and burning whatever scraps of wood they could find. Some dismantled the remains of bombed buildings just to feed their stoves. Food supplies were even more precarious. By January 1946, rations in some British-administered areas fell to 700 to 800 calories per person per day, far below the minimum needed for health. Malnutrition became widespread, particularly among children, whose growth was stunted, and the elderly, who were especially vulnerable to illness. Tuberculosis and other diseases spread rapidly in the cold, damp, and overcrowded living quarters. Relief agencies, including the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRRA, began operations, but their efforts could not match the scale of need. The refugee influx from the east continued, further straining resources. Newly arrived families often slept in railway stations, schools, or makeshift barracks. In some towns, tensions between local residents and expellees erupted into open hostility. The scarcity of food and fuel meant that every additional mouth to feed felt like an existential threat. Daily life became a matter of improvisation. The black market expanded, trading in everything from cigarettes to coal briquettes. Many Germans adopted what became known as Hamsterfahrten, hamster trips, into the countryside to barter for food with farmers. In exchange for family heirlooms, linens, or even wedding rings, they could secure potatoes, eggs, or meat. These trips were often made in the dead of night to avoid Allied patrols, which sometimes confiscated the goods. Politically, the Allies pressed forward with restructuring German society. Denazification hearings were held throughout the occupation zones, sorting individuals into categories: major offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and exonerated persons. The process, though intended to purge Nazi influence, was often chaotic. Some who had played significant roles in the regime managed to evade punishment, while others with minimal involvement were swept up in the bureaucracy. Meanwhile, the trials at Nuremberg dominated headlines. Broadcast on radio and reported in newspapers, they revealed the scale of atrocities committed during the war. For ordinary Germans, these revelations deepened a sense of national humiliation and moral reckoning. Conversations about responsibility, guilt, and the future became unavoidable. By the end of March 1946, Germany remained a country on the edge, politically restructured but economically broken, surviving day to day in a winter of scarcity. It was clear that peace had not yet brought relief, it had merely replaced the dangers of war with the equally lethal threats of hunger and cold. By mid-1946, Germany's post-war crisis was entering a new phase. The worst of the immediate hunger and freezing temperatures had eased with the arrival of spring, but the structural problems remained. The country was now firmly under Allied control, divided into 4 occupation zones managed by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. At first, this division was meant to be temporary. In practice, it was the first step toward Germany's permanent political fracture. The flow of expellees from Eastern Europe continued well into 1947. By the end of that year, nearly 12 million ethnic Germans had been uprooted from former German territories in East Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia, and from countries like Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania. These arrivals strained housing beyond breaking point. Many refugees spent months in transit camps before being relocated to rural villages or already overcrowded towns in the western zones. The economic situation was dire. The Allied dismantling of German industry, partly as reparations and partly to prevent any resurgence of military power, kept unemployment high. Factories lay idle. Railways struggled to move goods. Currency lost much of its value, and the black market became the backbone of daily survival. In some towns, barter replaced money entirely. At the same time, the political climate shifted. The wartime alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies dissolved into open hostility. In 1947, tensions sharpened over economic reconstruction. The United States introduced the Marshall Plan in 1948, offering massive aid to Western Europe, including West Germany. The Soviets refused participation and tightened their control over their zone, laying the groundwork for what would become East Germany. Berlin became the symbolic heart of this new divide. In June 1948, the Soviets imposed a blockade, cutting off all rail, road, and canal access from the western zones into the city. In response, the United States and Britain launched the Berlin Airlift, an unprecedented logistical effort that delivered food, fuel, and medicine by air for almost a year. More than 200,000 flights kept West Berlin alive until the blockade was lifted in May 1949. The social consequences of division were profound. Families found themselves split by the emerging Iron Curtain. Refugees who had fled eastward during the war could no longer return. Communities along the inner German border became isolated, with fences and guard posts replacing roads and fields. By the end of 1949, the division was formalized. In May, the western zones merged into the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. In October, the Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. The shared national identity of the pre-war years was gone, replaced by 2 separate states, each tied to opposing sides of the Cold War. The immediate suffering of 1945 to 46 had given way to a different kind of endurance, learning to live within the constraints of occupation, displacement, and geopolitical rivalry. For millions of Germans, the war had ended, but the consequences would shape their lives, and their country, for generations.